That's okay. Well, somebody just said we're good at it, so nobody cares. So they said we'll take care of it
Well,
all.
we prioritize for you.
Yeah, right, exactly. All right, let's go ahead and get started. It's 7 after the hour. And we promise to have you out before the sun goes down. Oh, so that it does work. All right. So we all set online, Jeff? Okay, perfect. Thanks to everybody for coming on such a nice day. I know that the way things have been the last couple of weeks, we get days like this, we don't want to be sitting in here, but I do appreciate everybody participating. This is the second meeting of the sort of public hearing process of this resilience planning process that we're going through. We will have a third one in the latter part of July once we assimilate all the comments coming from this meeting, and then that will be a presentation to the select board and the town as a whole. So just by real quick review, there was a strategic task force put together by the town back in September last year, and we had 10 citizens, 10 folks applied, handful of us here today. Pretty broad cross-section of the town between fishing and the boat club and the parks and conservation commission, et cetera. One of our first roles was to bring in some outside consulting support. We did that. That's who's here tonight. Blake and Todd from WSP, or I should say the other way around, from Richardson and Associates and WSP. We're in the current phase of public engagement. I've mentioned that, and plan development. The final deliverable will be, roughly speaking, in July. And I wanted to make a couple of comments. The resilience plan that's being put together to address long-term sea level rise and storm surge and that sort of thing, it includes both the working waterfront and the public areas of the park. There were some, I think, early on confusion or misconception that we were focusing on just the working waterfront, and that's not true. It's the park as a whole. And there are working waterfront aspects, absolutely, but the park as a whole is really the focus. And there will also be looking at estimates of probable cost for everything that gets proposed, and we'll show you some of it tonight. So, but let's speak about the grant briefly, because there's been grant language kind of floating around. We won this grant, what's it for, et cetera, et cetera. So again, the planning process that we're in the process of now with Blake and with Todd, that's the entire park. It's Marine Park, it's Walker Park, it's the working waterfront area, it's the town pier, it's all of that, all right? Now, the grant that was received was for a $2 million grant for just the working waterfront part of that entire project. So this grant was part of a $25 million initiative, with, you can see, with the DOT, with Department of Marine Resources, and GOPIF, which is a short way of writing the Governor's Office on Policy Innovation in the Future. Essentially, it's sort of the climate-related stuff. So you took the road people, marine resources people, and the environmental people, put them together, came up with this $25 million and said, put in an application. And it was aimed at reinforcement, as you say here, piers, wharves, electrical systems, fuel systems, et cetera, related to the working waterfront. And part of it is, one of the stipulations, there is a one-to-one match in here. So we got a $2 million grant. If we're going to spend their $2 million, we got to come up with our own $2 million. That's a down-the-road process, okay, fairly quickly down the road, but that's part of it. So I just want to make the point that the output from this current planning is informing how we're going to spend those funds on the working waterfront. It's not a separate project, it's just part of it. And we had some early on confusion about which was which, and I just want to sort of address that. We've had a couple of site tours, multiple planning and feedback meetings. This is one of them. We've had direct input from a bunch of different folks, and we have individuals who have stepped up and said that they wanted to help. That some people have, expertise, those of us on the committee, and even some other individuals. And we had Sam Lowry, who's a neighbor of Denise's over near the harbor, came up with this. One of his company used to do fluid dynamics. So they would come in and they would say, if you have a airplane or a car or whatever going through a medium, i.e. we have waves coming up the harbor, it's a predictive kind of thing, right? You have a wave, you have a wavelength, you have depth of the harbor, you have the width of the harbor. So then now it's just math. Now it's really complicated math, okay? Trying to figure out what's going to happen. But Sam, just on his own, through his company, figured out I might be able to help model the harbor in terms of how it behaves, what the waves are. And so he's asking all these questions. But he did a bunch of early on stuff that really didn't, he was just trying to wing it because it's probably a little bit down the road process. But one of the things he did was we said, well, let's look at the boat club. So there's your boat club at the height of the storm. And this one, the guy standing in front is Mark Van Balen. So Mark is here, right? So we said Mark is standing in front of the boat club on a staff facing the waves, all right? And what this is a curve. These curves here show the amount of pressure on the front of the boat club during a storm where the water's about halfway up. And it's between 12 and 16,000 pounds of pressure when the waves hit, the waves don't hit, but that water pressure. So this is the kind of thing we look at to figure out, what are we going to do? What's the strength of the granite wall or a bulkhead, or in this case, the front of the boat club, or Mark, can you hold all the waves back? But those are the kinds of things, and so this is also the expertise that a guy like Sam, who's not even part of the task force, said, I'll help. And it helps us understand and visualize, and we can get a whole lot fancier with this, and I'm not going to go through that now, but I just wanted to give you a flavor for some of that. So what are our objectives tonight? It's to discuss the concept plans, right? So Blake and Todd are going to get up and they're going to say, here's what we think we can build. And some of us have seen various iterations of that, and it's been informed on the various public input pieces he'll talk about. But that's one of the things. We want to look at what we think we want to do. Want to solicit questions and feedback. That's the most critical part, okay? Because we might think it's a good idea. You might think it's a dumb idea. Or you might say, yeah, that's good, but did you think about that? I mean, we're not all seeing. We all have our own version of, our own perspective. So the idea is to get, draw you guys out and saying, I like that idea, or I think that's a bad thing because of this, whatever. So that's what we really need tonight. And he'll talk about another survey that they put together that we'll put out townwide as well. And that'll inform the final deliverable that we have in July, that we present to the town as a whole. And ultimately, it will come to a vote, to the town itself to say, is this something we want to do? So without further ado, that's all I have to say. And so, yeah, Blake, it's all yours.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Bill. Maybe they can chop out that 2-second transition when they put this online for everybody else. It's a pleasure to be back here, and it seems like most of you in the crowd are familiar, but I would imagine that some folks might be catching this midstream. And so the first few slides are just to lay the groundwork and ensure that we're all on the same page and have a baseline. Then we'll talk a little bit about some early ideas and collect your input. So, as has been mentioned, the focus of this study has been Marine Park and Walker Park. And one of the questions we received after the last public meeting was, what is your final deliverable? And I just thought I would clarify that at the beginning as well. And so we are tasked with coming up with a set of recommendations that would be compiled in a final summary report, and that would be made available to, of course, the community, but also the select board, and decisions can be informed down the line from this work that we're all taking part in today. So it's a set of recommendations that's the final deliverable. The storm event itself is something that in the last public meeting we spent a lot of time reviewing to ensure people understood why a project like this might happen in the first place. So if you didn't have the benefit of seeing that, you can find it online. There's a project webpage, and that includes the videos and a lot more information in background. As has been mentioned, we're at the second public meeting. The third would be toward the end of July. In between those meetings, we have the benefit of working with a task force that's quite diverse in their areas of focus, and that's been a tremendous sounding board and a real strength to this process thus far, but we've also had opportunities to interface with the general public numerous times and through site walks, hear firsthand from folks. So before I get into any of our proposed solutions, I might just bring up Todd Coffin from WSP, who's our engineering partner, just to baseline a little bit of the flood mapping exercise that began our work.
Thanks, Blake. Again, Todd Coffin. I'm a geologist and a project manager with WSP, an engineering firm located in Portland, Maine. And I want to cover just a few initial concepts that we discussed at the kickoff meeting in April, just to help lay the groundwork. And a couple things we discussed. One is that Maine's climate is getting warmer and wetter. If you look at plots of average annual temperature, you see a steady rise since the early 1900s, with no sign of that being abated even through today, and likewise increasing average annual precipitation. At the same time, we have warming of Maine's coastal waters, which are fueling more powerful storms, and it feels like those storms are even occurring more frequently. We just think back at January 2024, the nearly back-to-back storms and the impacts, and how it felt like the frequency is really increasing in those storm events. And on top of that, we have a parallel effect of melting of global polar ice caps, as well as glacial ice, and the thermal expansion of the oceans, causing, as Bill mentioned, steady increases in sea level rise. So what we decided to do in combination with Richardson Associates was develop a series of flood maps, which would baseline, as you can see in the shaded area, the base 100-year FEMA flood zone. But on top of that, we've developed 3 sea level rise scenarios. The first being 0.8 feet by 2030, 1.5 feet by 2050, and 3.9 feet by 2100. And those 3 scenarios are based on a recommendation of the Maine Geological Survey and the Maine's Climate Council. So they're numbers that are fairly used often in Maine when conducting sea level rise planning and evaluating the vulnerability and resilience planning in Maine's waterfront. So this is a zoom in, a blow up of the map, where we can see along the Camden's north part of the harbor, and also, Rockport's north part of the harbor, and the west side of the harbor, the Marine Park, as well as the boatyard and the boat club building. These are areas where you can see in the yellow the 0.8 feet rise by 2030, 1.5 by 2050, and 3.9. And the good part about Rockport's harbor is there is a floodplain, but next to it is fairly steep topography rising up to the surrounding neighborhoods. And that bowl-like effect really constrains and prevents the floodwaters from expanding and inundating further inland, as you might expect. But what does happen is that water depth becomes significantly deep during a major storm event. So you could have as much as 4 to 6 feet of flood water during the 100-year storm, which is a pretty powerful storm, by 2050, and even 6 to 9 feet of inundation in a powerful storm by 2100. So planning needs to consider those different scenarios, and whether it's incremental planning or if you're rebuilding a structure, you need to be mindful of those sea level rise scenarios, and that's the purpose of these maps. And we also took a look, further southwest in Rockport's harbor, looking at Walker Park, where there is a bit more inundation by the 2100, 3.9 foot scenario, because there's a little bit of a low-lying trough along the topography in that park. So that is a little bit more vulnerable because of the landscape that's there in this location. I will note that in the formal maps that we presented to the town, there is more detail of the flood elevations, the various flood zones, but that's a lot of detail that really isn't necessary in this context. We just want to convey that the maps have been developed, and we'll see during Blake's discussion, and I'll add some commentary, plots that are showing the different flood levels, critical elevations of the ground surface or the floor levels of buildings, which help us understand the vulnerability in different parts of the harbor. Blake?
So jumping back into site analysis, there were key factors in addition to just flooding that were considered from the beginning. So we've talked a bit about the working waterfront. That's certainly a focus. Can't underscore enough that we understand that people's livelihoods require, this to operate, to meet their needs. There's also recreational components to both Walker Park and Marine Park that are incredibly important to this community. There's a history and legacy of the lime kilns and other elements that you see out there, and an overlay of ecology. So in the last round, we had asked folks to take a public survey, and today I thought I'd share those survey results because that helped to inform the development of the preliminary alternatives. So initially, we just asked folks if they were members of the community at large or if they had any involvement with the Harbor Committee, Conservation Commission, or Parks and Beautification Committee. And you can see most of the responses are from the public at large, although we did have great participation from those committees, and we thank them for all they do. They've been actually really valuable to us through this process because they have a fairly deep understanding of the project area. We've received 131 responses, which was just an incredible response rate, and we're hopeful that the survey tonight might make its way around so that we have a good distribution and a better understanding of where folks are seeing the developed work to date. The second or third question we had asked is, are you aware that flooding has already impacted Rockport's harbor during storm events? And most people were very much aware of that, so we didn't see a need to dive deeper into that today. We asked what aspects of Rockport's harbor they value most, and we asked people to select their top three. The top responses, as you can see, are public access to the water, the working waterfront, recreation, parks and open space, a rich sense of history, and ecology, and then lesser responses for things like tourism, which I found to be interesting. We had also given folks the opportunity to add additional comments if they so choose, and you can see those comments here. So natural beauty, the Rockport Boat Club, and other comments were logged, and that's been really valuable for our team to understand the priorities for the community, and you'll see how that's reflected in the draft plans. What potential flood impacts concern you most? Impacts to infrastructure was the top response, and I'd have to imagine that that's because there are concerns around the viability of the working waterfront with flooding and storm impacts. There's also stormwater concerns with the location of the pump stations and various elements of public infrastructure that are within the project area. After that were impacts to public parks, which is understandable since the project area is largely is two public parks. Ecological degradation is also top of mind, and then there were other responses as well, but those were the primary areas of focus, and again, additional input. And the last question was really, was there anything else that people would like to share? And people were really forthcoming, but the responses that we received in this section just demonstrate sort of the transect, I suppose, of people's priorities. So I'll just read a few to give you an idea of how various folks have different areas of focus. One said, we need to plan for the future or we will be financially sorry. And a lot of studies have actually shown that if you're proactive about addressing flooding and adapting prior to events, that funds can be spent more wisely than if you're retroactively trying to solve a problem and doing so in a way that's just reactionary. Other responses were, focus on the working waterfront, that they want to maintain the undeveloped character of the harbor, invest in the future, long-term planning and potential costs associated with resilience planning, active working waterfront, just various things. And so you can see these sort of go on and on. So the question sort of became, well, there's a lot of different points of view. How do we approach that? And so we developed 6 key drivers. One is to support the working waterfront. Second is to look at the future of the boat club. Third would be to enhance public access and host community activities and events. The fifth would be enable harbor operations. And the sixth might be foster ecology, education, and play. And if you bring that all together, then we're hopeful that the preferred strategy is one that is not just sort of meeting one need, but rather is a balanced plan that meets all of these needs. And it seems to us as though the way that this place operates today is it does many different things for many different people. And we've been trying to balance all of that. So after the last public meeting, there was a request at the task force session that we had as a follow-up to see if WSP and RNA would be willing to come back out to site for another site walk. And we said, sure thing. So we were out there, and primarily we were joined by representatives of the boat club and folks from the working waterfront. That was an opportunity for us to go deeper on a lot of items and really hear firsthand. So I'm like sitting there with a clipboard, jotting things down, and that was incredibly valuable. So special thanks to all the folks who joined us for that trip, and many of the task force members also were there. Out of that, we produced what we called the site walk notes, and that just has all sorts of input. I mean, there were things that some of the commercial fishermen had cited that they thought were actually working fine. And then there were other areas where people said, you know, there's a real problem here and it needs to be addressed. That was sort of also building on some information we had received from the harbor master about operations and things. And so if you combine all of the input from the public surveys, the input we've had from the task force, the input we've had from the harbor master, and these various site walks, there was a lot of data points. So let's get into proposed scenarios. The existing conditions for Marine Park is where we'll start. And just to orient y'all, this is Pascal Avenue, High Street, and the entry into Marine Park as you understand it today. So this is nothing proposed. This is just the lay of the land. So you've got the harbor master's office here, there's the pier, there's parking in a few different areas, there's the drop off to the boat ramp. The lime kilns are these rectangles in white. There's the Ped Bridge over to the commercial side of the harbor. The boat club is located here, and then Rockport Marine would be just here. So if we start at the boat club, what we're seeing in these flood scenarios is that in 100-year base flood elevation, that there's significant concern for building like this one. And so the do-nothing scenario would mean likely that this would struggle to exist in the future. And the last round we went into more detail, but this dashed line here in the gray that says 9 is the current elevation. And then you can see at the bottom of these bar graphs different time scenarios. So there's present day, short term, which is 2030, midterm, which is 2050, and long term, which is 2100. So we've looked at scenarios for 2050 for making the boat club more resilient, and we've looked at scenarios for 2100. This is what the boat club looks like today, as I'm sure you all know. And the thinking here is that rather than elevate everything on this side of the harbor, which could be incredibly expensive and daunting, that we might focus on key zones that are particularly vulnerable, like the boat club. So a structure like this could be raised, and there are examples of that that have been accomplished in Maine, some using various grant funds, and you know, a structure like this one has some historic merits that could also lend itself to that sort of funding. The thought with this scenario is to raise the finished floor 6.5 feet and have the boat club in the same location. If you were to do that, you might consider doing it in sort of 2 lifts. So the white area here would be a terrace that's created. That's about 3 feet higher than existing grade today. And then there would be another 3 feet or so up to the boat club. In plan view, you're looking top down. So this is the water, this is the boat club. It's in exactly the same position that it sits today in this site plan. What we were doing was studying, access. So if you augment a building, as we're suggesting here, oftentimes there's a requirement to bring the building up to code, and it's best practice to make these structures accessible to everyone. And so it would be accessible through the use of a ramp system that brings you to the front door on the porch. There could also be a stair system. The details of all of this could be worked out, but it was just studying to make sure that in this amount of real estate, it's actually feasible to raise the building to this degree and still make it accessible. The darker black line here is representing that terrace edge. So that could be more of those granite blocks that are consistent with the character of the harbor today. The land adjacent here and here would be lower. So this would be elevated above in this scenario. And by going up to 15.5 for the finished floor elevation, it's above even the 1% flood scenario in 2050. And the mean high water line is much lower, as is the annual high tide. There may be some questions, is 6.5 feet high enough? What happens after 2050? These are good questions, and it would be short-sighted to come up with a scenario where we weren't anticipating changes. I mean, it may be that sea level rise happens more quickly than what studies today are estimating, or it may be that things are on track, but we hit 2050 and we need another adaptation measure. One thought is by creating that lower terrace, it provides a platform where temporary elements could exist. So really what you're struggling with beyond 2050 is that scenario where you have a major storm event. It's not addressing mean high tide, that's lower. So there could be an element like that. There are various low-tech ways to do it. There are more high-tech measures that could be considered. You could also consider elevating the building higher. So what does it look like if you go up 9 feet instead of 6.5? If you were up 9 feet, you're basically a story higher. You might be picturing examples of structures like that in places like the Outer Banks in North Carolina, or things where the lower level of the building is not the main floor in many cases. And so there's a building typology that can work in that scenario, but there's also some trade-offs. I mean, this was looking at the amount of ramp if you were making it fully accessible, and that may be a reason not to jump to the 9-foot scenario right away. But we thought it was worth doing the study to just look at how that may play out. So the recommendation from the consultant team is to look at that 6.5-foot scenario, which seems to address any near-term risk, midterm risk, and there's the option to address additional flooding in the future. The next area that we look at is the working waterfront seawall. And when we met with the commercial fishing folks out here, what they asked for was something to alleviate their concern of scour at the water's edge, which is basically destabilizing the granite block wall, because what would happen is water will overtop and it will carve out, in some cases, land because there's just an aggregate surface there today. Where they do have concrete, they were citing that those areas are more resilient to flood damage, and so the request was to think about adding a 6-foot band of pavement there so that scour is reduced and they're still able to access the edge of the bulkhead wall with their vehicles. And, you know, there are places that have done things like that. It's also an opportunity in our mind if you're investing in hardening that edge to think about, you know, potentially designating different uses for different zones so people are clear on how it's used, if that's helpful. And paint is very cheap. So just because it's a working aspect of the harbor doesn't mean it can't get a little love. There's also, you know, just some engineering measures that might need to be considered. So Todd Coffin was going to talk a little bit about your current seawall and things to think about in the future.
Thanks, Blake. Well, Blake mentioned we conducted an initial visit, which was during the wintertime, and there was quite a bit of snowpack. And then we came back later in the spring, and it was gorgeous, sunny, with no snow. But technically, we were able to see a lot more detail on the ground surface. So when we were walking to the west side of the boat club building, we looked down and we could see some isolated sinkholes, you know, depressions where it appeared that soil was washing out from beneath, and potentially because of wave action that was hitting the seawall. And we also saw some stress cracks that were parallel to the seawall, indicating some movement at depth potentially, which over time could result in some larger instability. So one thought we had and discussed with Richardson and Associates was the likely need to, you know, conduct some remediation of the soil that could potentially be washing out. So the first thing you'd want to do is excavate, understand what's happening at depth. One option is to ultimately excavate behind the seawall around the tide cycle, so you're not excavating during high tide, installing a stone drainage layer, and then a geotextile, which would prevent and filter any fines from washing out in the future. And this may not be hundreds of feet. It may be really distinct areas where the stress is being observed at the ground surface. But right now, we really don't understand what's happening. There would need to be some further identification of what the source is and how big, you know, the opening might be at depth that's causing the ground surface to collapse. But this is an opportunity to invest in, and we think prioritize some of the investment, because if it's left unabated, soils could continue to wash out and ultimately threaten the stability of the seawall and the soil and embankment around the boat club building. So, yeah.
And then the working wharf is the next area, and this is one of those areas that's actually more prone to flooding, and so it would benefit from just slightly raising this. Remember the boat club we were just looking at, we were talking about raising the land there, and so the thinking is that this would just be raised 2 feet up to that interface, which should work fine. And then there's a question of the utilities in this area, and those would want to be raised slightly higher or protected, but today they're unprotected and a liability of sorts. Around the corner from that, as you're moving toward Rockport Marine, the benefit of raising the grade here, as we understand it, is just that there's really low clearance, and it makes operations in that transition from this area over to Rockport Marine challenging for vehicles with low beds. And so there's an added benefit here by raising grade. At the same time, you know, the truck turning movement could be facilitated by adjusting the turning radius in this location so that that accommodates those movements. That's some of the recommendations associated with the commercial side of things. In general, what we were hearing is that folks didn't want a large amount of change. One point they asked us to consider moving the boat club over, and then the most recent correspondence we've had is that they think it's actually enough room as they have it today. And so our approach has been a little bit pinpointed in where changes are proposed. On the park side of things, there's also flood inundation concerns. From the mean high water standpoint, for the most part, the existing seawall manages those. But when you look at the highest astronomical tide, then you do see overtopping. So during the storm events from the past few years, there has been some overtopping. And if you look at what's projected for 2030, then 2050 and 2100, then the park is likely to be overtopped. So the question becomes, does all of this get raised? And our thinking is probably not. Having a resilient waterfront doesn't mean like walling yourself off from the water. It means having a strategy in place that enables this place to move into the future in a way that makes sense for your community. And we have a strategy to do that. So at the moment, the concern is more that, when there's an event like that there's annually a lot of repair work, and that's getting old and unsustainable. And so, one thought was, well, if you've got this idea of having a ribbon around the edge of the park that's this sort of hardened apron that alleviates some of the concern for displacement of material behind the seawall, what can that do for the people whose priorities are for this to be a great recreational spot? And so our mind was, can we think of this as a boardwalk that becomes a buffer? If you're out there today, there's actually not a lot of pedestrian infrastructure in the park. And if you're someone who relies on a wheelchair or is less mobile or that sort of thing, then what's incredibly helpful is having a path that's actually paved in something that's more sturdy and stable. Associated with that, we envision a railing so that people are able to get to the water's edge in a way that they may not feel comfortable today. And those could certainly have gates and things to allow access out to boats and the various elements in the water. Here are a few precedents that just show, there's all kinds of different materials. There could be this sort of timber boardwalk that's mounted on top of that concrete foundation. There's stone that could be used. There's any number of things, but it begins to create this network within the park. And if you think back at what we were seeing from people's top priority, access to these public open spaces was number one in terms of the response. And today there's pretty limited access, and it can be quite challenging to get here. And once you're here, to get from one spot to the next. So this plan is what we're calling option A, and it leaves all of the roads and parking where they are. But it adds this sort of apron of paving, so a boardwalk, if you will, around the edge. And the orange lines are indicative of a pedestrian path network. So you could get from this side at a designated crossing and make your way either over toward the pedestrian bridge or up the slope. In the future, Maine DOT, DOT has plans for a bridge that would have sidewalks on either side. So we're thinking about how to connect to that in the future. There could also be a pedestrian path along the entry drive to create this network. So this is option A. Some people in the feedback forms were saying, I want it to be resilient, but I don't want change. So this was our attempt at having minimal amount of change, but adding some of the co-benefits while creating a more flood resilient park. The next option was thinking about, okay, if you're making this park flood resilient, then how do you do that in a way that enables you to have the most flexibility for adaptation over time? And when we were out there, we spotted zones like this, where, I'd be hard pressed to think that this is anyone's favorite spot at Marine Park. It just seems like it's not currently where the picnics happen. It's not currently where interpretation happens for historic elements. You don't park there. It's not used for access. And so the thought was, well, this area toward the water seems like the prime spot. Could we enlarge that and create a zone on the waterfront that's contiguous, that's not bisected by cars, to increase public safety and create like a zone for adaptation over time. And so option B is looking at doing that. And the way that's accomplished is by taking the road and in this segment, moving it toward the toe of slope in that area we were just looking at. And so that enables you then to enlarge this section of the park. You still would have parking proximate to the pier. And a lot of projects we work on will designate spots like this as loading zones so that, that shorter term parking to enable that to be convenient for folks who are moving things in and out. The orange lines in this scenario are indicative of the pedestrian pathways. So there's minimal crossings along the road. There's actually 4 additional parking spaces as a result of this geometry because the added curve gives you added length of road. We didn't impact this area which feeds into the boat ramp. This is all as it is today. And we understand that those turning movements are working, and so we haven't impacted that. There's an idea that there's still a boardwalk on the edge, but we've started to carve out like little zones where you could have seating and a series of lampposts along that edge and that sort of thing. So in general, this is looking at a more resilient strategy. It's also improving vehicular access. So there was a study done to look at creating a one-way drive in, and then the existing drive would be exit. And so if you were to do that, it would reduce congestion, and it's a fairly narrow road, so a number of people have commented on a desire to improve that. For the Harbor Master's office, this scenario is showing that in the near term, it stays where it is. And we'll talk about that a little more. But in the long term, it could move up slope so that it's out of harm's way, could move, or it could be a new building. Essentially, that enables there to be a future scenario for that down the line. So option B is looking at how you create flood resilience and just sort of tweak things, maintain all of the same programmatic elements, but find some efficiencies to do that. The landform here could be elevated. And so instead of just having a flat green park, there could be a slope. And so the park itself becomes more resilient to flooding in that way. And it enables us to create this condition where people are looking out to the water and they're separated from the cars that are parked behind them through the use of topography. So that could look something like this. And you see examples where, in addition to lawn, there could be native plantings and things incorporated. So that would work for also these special events that we talked about in the last round. So that area of the park, by being larger, would lend itself to fireworks displays and weddings and gatherings of all sorts. That was option B. Option C, this is the last one, is looking at something in between option A and option B. So it does have that curving road configuration from option B, but it doesn't add the additional point of entry. In this scenario, the park here would be terraced instead of having a sloping landform. So this would be flatter, but it would be elevated. So if you want to kick a ball on it, then this might be something that resonates with you. The boardwalk itself is more informal and the planting character is more informal, but it still provides that green buffer. So over time, you could imagine this being used to transition and address flood concerns with rising tides. In this scenario, there are less points of connection for the trail system. And on the commercial waterfront side, there's the addition of a pier that acts as a breakwater. And in this scenario, there would need to be modeling done to look at how that helps to shelter things inboard of it, but that could be coordinated with the commercial fishing aspects of the harbor if there was a desire to do so. So I had mentioned the Harbor Master's office. We've talked about the different flood projections. In general, this building is sited in a way that's slightly more advantageous than the boat club. And as you can see, the construction's more sturdy. So it's less, we believe, at risk in the near term. The elevation is at 11. So, all the way through nearly 2100, you're above the highest annual tide line. It's just the 1% base flood that we would be concerned with. So for that reason, we don't see a need to relocate it in the near term. It's just a matter of what's called dry flood proofing. And by having that apron in the foreground, we're hopeful that the scour near the building would be alleviated. And the utilities around it could be armored. In the long term, though, there is a spot that we feel would be probably a pretty good location for that structure. And so the thinking with this master plan is just we would recommend that that spot is left open so that that possibility remains in the future. The last piece, and then we'll move it to Q&A, is just Walker Park. And so Walker Park today is susceptible to flooding. This is the 2030 line, 2050 line, and 2100. And over time, it's anticipated that more of Walker Park is at risk during a major storm event. Although this is the playground area here in tan, and so it's out of that area of risk as anticipated. This little white box is the picnic shelter you may be familiar with. It's within that zone. So here's an image of what Walker Park looks like today and the area that's susceptible to flooding. And the thinking here is that it might be a great spot to look at nature-based solutions and plant the bank where flooding is anticipated. And we would, of course, recommend native planting materials that are appropriate for slope stabilization and then could be coupled with geotech fabrics or various other elements to underpin that and provide another measure of resilience while still allowing access to the water's edge, creating habitat, and be a great spot for interpretive signage, knowing that there's all kinds of kids and families who utilize that spot. So could be an awesome opportunity to daylight that to folks and create one less thing to mow. So on the plus side, a little less maintenance on that respect. Just some images of how that transition from the lawn to a more native palette on the water's edge might work. In this case, you've got topography working for you, so you're going to be looking out over that. It's not going to block the view of the water. So those are the preliminary ideas. There is another survey link where folks are encouraged to weigh in if they like option A, B, or C. There are other questions there as well, and a blank form if you'd like to provide any comments. This will be made available online also, and we're asking that people submit their feedback by the 11th so that we can incorporate that into our work moving forward. But that concludes the presentation portion, and if anyone has questions, then what would be great is if you just raise your hand and we'll get a mic out to you, and that way folks who are joining online will be able to hear your question also. And since it's recorded, that would just streamline things. So sure, thank you so much, and open it to Q&A.
Feedback, thoughts? Why don't you give it right to Mark and then behind him.
Oh, thanks, Bill. I appreciate the image of me standing in front of the boat club like King Canute, trying to hold back the tides. Unfortunately, he was not successful, but hey, what the hell? Anyway, So I appreciate the presentation. Just a couple of very quick comments. At the very end, this survey was, the responses were due by the 11th. The 11th of what? June or July?
Of June.
11th of June. Thank you for clarifying that. Okay. Second, in the modeling of the what we call the bulkhead, that is the granite face of the seawall there, I didn't hear any discussion about the stability of that actual pile of granite blocks. I mean, it's kind of like Legos, really. And I didn't hear any discussion about whether that whole thing is susceptible to collapse. So that's a technical question. There was some mention of, well, we could excavate behind and look at soil erosion. I think scouring is a very major issue, and if that is to be raised, then I would recommend serious attention be given to scuppers to allow water coming back down. Then the next comment, and then I'll sit down and shut up. Walker Park, this is a beloved park. It is very, very popular in our town, and I went down there just to look and see what was happening, and mothers and babies and strollers and everybody. However, there's another thing happening in town, and that is the development of what we call the RES site, now called, I believe, Rockport Commons, all right? And I believe that when that opens, that is a major addition to the town. I think that will change the use of Walker Park in ways that none of us understand. So anyway, so Walker Park is a moving target, in my opinion. Anyway, that's all I have to say.
Great. Yeah, thank you for the question. And I can respond initially in terms of the stability of the seawall. We had with us on the initial visit a marine structural engineer who commented how well the wall was performing overall, that there was strong verticality, it wasn't leaning. There were some select areas like near the harbor master's office where there was some loss of some of the interstitial blocking, which should be repaired and replaced. There are options like grouting behind the wall, which is injecting cement grout to help stabilize and strengthen the soil. But we felt really at this stage, we saw no evidence that the type of small sinkholes or stress cracks were happening pervasively all along the wall. So we would recommend more of an incremental approach at this point. And if the wall continues to perform well, based on the thousands of pounds of granite that are weighing that wall down, that you're in pretty good shape.
Yeah, and just for the Walker Park piece, I think that's great to be mindful of that maybe it's not so much that the program we see today would be the same program into the future. I think it's going to be an amazing asset for Rockport, that new park that's coming in. And, the thinking, I guess, for this resilience strategy is that by having that nature-based solution on the edge, then it is helping to preserve what is there into the future. So if there's, another programmatic need that evolves, that, that would still be a spot that's available for such a use. Other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, hi. My name is Phil Godet. I live in Rockport right here on Pascal Avenue, and member of the Boat Club. And I'm really happy to see that there are plans maybe for the Boat Club to exist for longer than a few more years. My concern is when you harden these places like the Boat Club or the Marine Park, doesn't that force the water to go somewhere else, the places that are not hardened, and what happens to them? Isn't there a solution that maybe we should consider that would protect the whole harbor rather than just bits and pieces of it?
Yeah, good question. So first part of the question or comment, I guess, was just that it's great that there are strategies looking into the future for the Boat Club. And then the second piece of it, as I understand it, is, if you're looking into elevating, would there be unintended consequences? So I don't know, Todd, if you want to speak to that piece of it.
Yeah, I can. I think an important clarification in the presentation is this is initial concept design. It's not engineering, or initial concepts. It's not engineering design, I should clarify. So if we were to propose raising a building or strengthening locally, we would be required, even by environmental permitting and town ordinances, to look at potential unintended consequences, looking at potential erosion that might be aggravated adjacent to, say, the boat club if there was some armoring that occurred. I guess the good news in the larger scenario is that the bulk of the harbor is protected. There's seawall that's quite extensive. It's a reasonable height compared to the near term, mean high water and the highest annual tide. So we wouldn't expect, aggravated, dislodging of blocks by simply raising the boat club building, for example. But we would want to look at, the impacts, as Bill mentioned, that modeling that was done around wave action and the power of the waves. Could those waves be reflected into some other feature or embankment, like the embankment behind the boat club building? That would all have to be looked at before anything was constructed. Hope that helps.
Right, and maybe the last part of the question was about, wouldn't there be a resilience strategy, for the whole thing? And we feel like, the right fit might be a strategy where it's really point specific, and it would be really daunting to think about, elevating everything. And there are a lot of, parks these days that are on the water that are deemed floodable parks. And it seems like, that's counterintuitive to some people when thinking about resilience planning initially. But what that means is that the elevation of your park is closer to the water level in the day-to-day. You're not 20 feet up waiting for, that 2100 scenario. And so you're maintaining that connectivity. And I think that's going to be a real asset. So our strategy has been one where, we're looking at critical infrastructure, we're looking at access, and we're looking at structures first. And then, providing some degree of hardening in localized areas, but not trying to bite off more than we can chew.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Rockland has a breakwater, which I think probably helps a bit to reduce the waveage, at least in Rockland Harbor. Yep. It doesn't do anything for sea level rise, but could we consider something like that in Rockport Harbor to reduce the height of the waves coming into the harbor and maybe reduce the requirement for all these other places to be hardened up?
Yeah, I could comment real quickly. I think to be fair and balanced, it's something that could be on the table. I think it has its applications depending on the size of the mouth of the harbor, but there's also often unintended concerns around traffic of boating, the permitting and impact to the aquatic community by building a structure like that, and they tend to be super expensive. So you might find greater benefit and value to dollars invested in the inner harbor by doing localized resilience measures versus spending a lot of money on something that might be ultimately viewed as intrusive, impeding traffic, or having a strong environmental impact. But I wouldn't say there's no scenario where that makes sense. I think it's something that could be looked at the conceptual level. We screened it out early because of the available funding and the priorities of the community aspect of this harbor, but it certainly has some merit.
So in option C, you had the addition of the pier, and I'd love to have you guys go into a little more detail on that, and what benefit is there in that, and how, like in particular, how does it affect the boat club? How does it help the fishermen, which is part of the working waterfront aspect to this whole plan?
Yep. So that was an idea that's evolved through this process, and the exact geometry that we're showing in this plan, again, I want to caveat, it's a sketch at this point. There could be modeling done, as Todd will talk about, in terms of the actual length and feasibility of that. But the idea is that if that's able to attenuate wave action, that the areas inboard of that may be at less risk from that perspective. So I'm not sure, Todd, if you wanted or...
Yeah, I think one of the pieces of feedback that we received from some of the walkthroughs and from some of the discussions we've had is there's a lot of congestion in that area in terms of the boat traffic and the ability of mainly lobster to function, picking up and dropping off, and making that a sort of functionally useful thing. That was one of the early genesis of the idea of pushing the boat club 10 feet further away so we could open that area up a little bit more to make that a little more useful. Then someone mentioned, well, what's the idea? Maybe we put another wharf in here to expand the area that's being used to make it easier. So and then the ancillary benefit of whether or not we can use that to absorb or deflect some of the energy. To the earlier point that you made about concern about adjacent properties, one of the things we talked about very early on in the task force meetings was we had to pay attention, do no harm to adjacent properties. In other words, we don't need to make it worse for Sam over at Rockport Marine because we just decided to deflect all our waves his direction. I mean, that's not working, that's not functional. And Sam's on the task force, so he's well aware of that as well. So there is concern that we don't do that, and we discussed that early on.
Yeah, I also wanted to highlight a couple of the slides that Blake showed that have some temporary measures that are brought in, like it's almost the equivalent of a Jersey barrier or mooring blocks that are stacked that in advance of a storm that's predicted, you bring in to knock the wave heights down 2 or 3 feet, which is essentially what a small breakwater does like that, or jetty does, or even a larger breakwater that might be put at the mouth of the harbor. But these are lower cost, highly mobile systems that can be brought in and removed if there's a storm coming, versus the expense and time and permitting and potential impact of a larger breakwater structure. So we're trying to be practical, but we think that the innovation of temporary structures like this inflatable, you inflate it with water and it becomes very sturdy and very resilient, or sand-filled boxes. You see these now at Popham Beach, where they're placing it in front of the Coast Guard station as a temporary protective measure. So we're trying to find some more nimble solutions that are more cost beneficial without building a major structure. But and those have their place, though. I want to acknowledge that in some settings.
You have to have ideas, right, or thoughts. How does it feel to lose the parking area that right now sort of divides the area next to the harbor master's office and the rest of the park? How do folks feel about the concept of making that more of a continuous park instead of the way it's currently configured? Abby, do you want to say anything?
Give a thumbs up.
Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate the way that we're not losing any parking, we're actually gaining parking, is that correct?
Yep.
Yep, and then the fact that it's continuous green space is a huge benefit, because right now it's a parking lot that separates the 2 green spaces, and we've had 2 kids actually cars impact kids, one of which is my nephews, because you can't see around, it's not safe the way it is. It's not efficient. There's so many things that it's not. So no, I appreciate that funnel that kind of comes around in the S. Like it's still the same width, right?
Yep.
So yeah. And I know that the entrance that was fairly cost prohibitive when looked at initially, or is that was would the concept be in the B plan? Yeah.
Yeah, this extra entry drive, one of our tasks in the next phase, once we understand folks' priority in terms of A, B, or C, is to cost out those elements. So there would be a line item if this were to be the preferred scenario or a hybrid scenario that includes that entry drive. And associated with that would be recommendations on how implementation could be phased. So projects like this often take a while to come to fruition, and there are things that need to be done right away, and others that could come online as funds or appetite for that fall into place. So yeah, by no means would this be one size fits all. So if folks are doing the survey, we're encouraging them to think big and just select, where you would want to see things end up eventually. And then we'll do the hard work of figuring out, costs associated, potential grant funds, other funding sources, and a phasing and implementation strategy to work toward that end goal.
Yeah, put another way, when you do the survey, don't worry about how much it costs.
Yeah,
Tell us
well,
what you
so-
think you want.
Yeah, I will
Okay.
make one comment on that. You make it easy to get people in and get people out. You're making it easy for people to get in and get people out. So it's already, we're at sort of a saturation point at times down there where there's times where it's just bananas and people have to work to get down there. So if we're making it, so that it's just one different way of thinking of it. If we're making it super easy, right now it's not super easy. You have to sort of have some local knowledge or really work to get down there. And that's, a little bit part of the, I wouldn't say charm, but people have to really want to be there. So just another way of thinking about it. But it would be a lot safer to have it in and then in and out as well. So I talked out of both sides of my mouth.
Could you show option A also, please?
Sure, yeah.
Is there any reason that the wharf extension, is there any reason the wharf extension couldn't be included in option A and option B also?
Nope. So it could be incorporated, and the way the survey works is we ask folks to identify if they like A, B, or C, or none of the above. And then there's a comment field. So if you are someone who likes one of those but would like some other elements from another, then I'd encourage you to, add that into the comment field, and that way we'll be able to track sort of, if there are elements of one or another that should be incorporated.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Blake, if you go back to option C.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wait a minute. What happened to the one with the extra, where the entrance was different?
Sorry, that's B.
Oh, B, I'm sorry. So the where the entrance is right now, you've got a red line there. Is that simulating an actual drive, where a car could come through there, or?
Yeah, sorry. So the idea here would just be that there's a curb cut and an entry road that's in gray, and then the orange color is pedestrian movement. So it seems like if you go through all the trouble of putting in the entry drive, that having a sort of sidewalk associated would be advantageous. And then there's the potential for connection to where there's a point of crossing. As you all know, like the continuous sidewalk is on this side, and there would be the desire to have a safe point of crossing, looking at view cones.
So
Blake-
my question is, could that, if an actual road and entry for cars is prohibitively expensive, could you look at an option to make that bike path or a walking path, scaled back? Because I think it would add quite a nice feature to be able to, if you're on a bike, to be able to come down and get back up, because the grade is presumably going to be a lot less difficult for people coming in the current entrance.
Yeah, no, I think you absolutely could do that. And what the study showed for the road grading is that it was feasible to get a road in. So if we can get something in that's that wide, doing something more narrow is certainly feasible if there's an appetite to do that. And yeah, that could certainly be considered.
Blake, you want to talk a little bit about the entrance on the other side, as far as some of the changes you were
here?
talking about, the pedestrian
Yeah.
right in here?
Sure. So for those who are pretty familiar with this area, you might know that there's an existing retaining wall here that sits behind where folks store kayaks. And one thought was that, that slope as it exists today is quite steep, and the set of stairs there is, could use a little love. It's a little rickety. And we had done a study to see what would happen if you were to look at having a ramp behind where the kayaks are stored. And it works out that you could actually do that, which, in the future, when there's a sidewalk on either side of the bridge that leads into town means that that point of entry might actually be really great, and might be one less reason to cross the road for folks who are on that side. So this scheme was really looking at trying to just maximize connectivity in response to the public feedback we had in the last round.
I have two comments. One is on the most recent, because we have been doing the Village Partnership Initiative study, so there has been some work already done on what the pathway configurations and sidewalks, so we just want to make sure we're not repeating work or having inconsistent work products on that, so I just would want to make sure that gets incorporated.
Yep.
Two, I wonder about pavement, adding additional pavement through that area in terms of stormwater management. If you have that, an entirely new paved road, plus that, and of course, we all know what the harbor looks like after a rain event.
Yep.
Does that add to concerns with stormwater?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. And certainly adding impervious surface means that there could be more concentrated runoff than if that was vegetated. But typically what happens for things like this is you would have a swale that's directing water downslope. And on these schemes, there's all of these like dark green areas, which in our mind are opportunities for native planting within the park area. Oftentimes those are actually stormwater treatment zones, right? So it could be that we use the landscape to be more of a sort of performance-based palette where they're treating stormwater and allowing for localized infiltration. So I don't think it would be a deal breaker to add impervious surface. I think the other opportunity there is to think about, if you're relocating the parking stalls, are those just standard asphalt, or would we think about permeable paving? I think by thinking about permeable paving, it does a couple things for you. It breaks down like visually the width of the road and might help with traffic calming, but it also just means you're not then sheet flowing that water into those systems that are planted. So there could be some strategies like that, but I think you're bringing up a really good point that, that would need to be considered to avoid unintended consequences where we create a bathtub. Yeah. Yeah.
Just to Bill's question about comments on the on rearranging the entrance and the curve in the park within Marine Park, and as I read that, I'm thinking there is a berm that parking in that new curve in the parking lot
Here,
works.
yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really great idea, and I agree with Abby and Bill that we're frequent users of Marine Park, but I think setting that parking back up against the steeper hill is a very good use of that not valuable, I won't say valuable, but that unused space that you pointed out. And I think having a little slope on Marine Park would be very good, and I think RES will the new park at RES will provide a lot of flat playing field. So,
Yeah.
just feedback.
No, that's really helpful to know. And hopefully for the preferred scenario at the end, we'll like model it so you all can spin around in the thing and see it. Sometimes it's hard to get that sense in the 2D plan. Any other questions or comments?
I'm just going to add on about Walker Park. I'm a huge fan of Walker Park and know a lot of people that have been huge fans of Walker Park. And it is a different space that provides a lot of families to elder people access to the harbor that is a quieter space, not as busy a space as Marine Park. And I think it would be important to get public input on that, because I don't, as appreciative as we are of the RES site park, it's a total gift. I don't think people were thinking it was, if we have this park, we won't have Walker Park. So I think that feedback needs to be developed.
Yeah, noted, thank you. I had shared, I think, in the last round, my experience going there with a younger family member visiting, and we spent a lot of time in the tide pools there. So I have an appreciation for what you're talking about. Anything else?
Yeah, just one quick comment. You know, Blake mentioned in a number of instances using nature-based solutions for improved resilience and reduced erosion. And I wanted to comment that a lot of the grant funding that's available is moving more and more toward funding solutions that are nature-based. The use of vegetation along the waterfront, treatment of stormwater using vegetation and swales and low slope zones that allow sediments to drop out. So I think we should be mindful of incorporating those elements, and Blake's team was thoughtful in including those, but they have a lot more punch than paving and armoring, and I'm sure this audience is appreciative of that as well. So thank you.
If there's nothing else, let's go eat. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.